I knew I was growing on her, though. One night, I was on foot, as I always was, and I was standing at a stoplight just north of the loop. And this girl pulled up to me on a bicycle, and she took off her bike helmet, and it was Martha. And she gave me a compliment on a review that I had written in that day's Chicago Sun-Times of the Factory Theater Company's breakdance parody sequel, Poppin' and Lockdown 2 Dance the Right Thing. Hey, man. Great review of the Factory show. My friend directed it. I thought, oh my God, this is the most glamorous punk rock indie shit has ever happened to me. Keep it together, man. Keep it together, man. Don't make a face. Jesus. So it was all happening. And before too much longer, Martha was an editor on a big story that I wrote for Section 1. Now, Section 1. Totally big league. The hot stuff in the Reader was in the first section. Media criticism, ball-busting reporting on civic corruption and police brutality, and movie reviews that made everybody crazy, and 20,000-word insider stories about pot farmers and Southside teachers, and Gen X Wicker Park scenesters whose public social demises were usually positioned as cautionary tales about acting like too big of a jackass in the art world. If you could actually get to the end of the story. I don't care who you were in Chicago. It did not matter during this era. At some point, everyone in the city pretended to have read a Reader cover story in its entirety. We all faked it. Section 1 was that important. I wanted to do a good job for Martha and for my first big Section 1 feature, so I emailed Martha on a Monday morning and I told her that I had gotten a juicy social item the night before and could we get it into next week's Reader. I was pretty impressed with myself because the night before I had been invited through a friend of a friend to attend the late night funeral death ritual commemorating the dissolving of the Defiant Theater Company. Martha replied by saying, "Oh yeah, my friend invited me to that. I meant to go." Defiant was this really edgy fringe theater company that produced gutsy, raucous plays in the 90s. At least that's what all of them told me at the time, and I believed them. Their funeral was really just a big obnoxious party where a lot of people gave teary speeches about plays past and days and plays past. There were stage pistols with blanks that kept getting fired, and there was a very precocious teenager from New Trier who had kind of been a Defiant Theater mascot since she appeared in a macabre Carol Churchill play with them as a child, and they had her give a talk. I went to the Defiant Theater funeral not intending to write about it, but it was so full of atmosphere and a certain kind of history, and I found myself taking notes on some starchy white paper towels from the men's room with a borrowed pen. At one point, a drunkard director I didn't know saw me interviewing the New Trier girl and interrupted us to assure her that she should never trust a theater journalist. And so for the next 3 days, I tried to construct these paper towel notes into a Section 1 feature story. And I didn't know how to write a lead. My notes were sketchy at best. Everything had to be re-reported and fact-checked and heavily edited. And if I had been my editor, I would have been really irritated. And Martha seemed really irritated. We were emailing, of course, but we also talked on the phone probably like a dozen times in 3 days. I was not an experienced journalist, and as an investigative reporter, I couldn't find a pubic hair in a whorehouse at rush hour. But she kept making me rewrite and rearrange, and she checked all my sources to make sure I wasn't exaggerating, and she made sure this dumb little eulogy for this sweet, bratty theater troupe was going to be accurate and worth reading. And by the end of the week, when there were no stupid questions left for me to ask Martha because I had asked them all, Martha, exhausted from dragging me and my story across the finish line, closed that week's paper, probably went home for a beer, and then started again the next week with some new sumbitch who's got a cocktail story on napkins, and she has to teach him journalism from scratch. 4 sections a week, every week. I share this with you because shortly after my brief stint writing for the Chicago Reader, Craigslist all but completely zapped the paid classifieds, and the Reader, like many of the best publications around the country, became decimated. Even Martha eventually packed her bags. She writes books now. The Chicago Reader still exists, and it still covers as much of the city as possible. And it still even takes on young new writers when it can, which is awesome. But the fact is that you can't afford to back check and conceptually overhaul major feature stories about American fringe art if guys who want to get spanked and wear diapers can meet each other for free online and with a picture. Something even the kinkiest reader personal ad never offered. So times are hard. Unlike most Americans in the last decade, the Chicago reader has gotten skinny. But hang in there, my friend. There's always going to be a lesbian in Rogers Park needs to line her birdcage. I miss the old reader, of course, and I'm terrified for what's going to happen to journalism, but mainly I think I'm mad because my 20s are barely a few years behind me, and my professional training in them now sounds like an episode of the Flintstones. Which means, depending on how long I choose to feel wistful and self-pitying about it, I might spend the rest of my life sounding like a goddamn baby boomer. And that is so annoying. Thanks, gang.